Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. My father's voice was calm. Not angry. Not panicked. Just practical. Like he was declining an extended warranty at a dealership. She wouldn't want to live like that anyway. A pause. Paper sliding against a clipboard. The faint scratch of a pen. Sign here, Mr. Clark, someone said. And then he did. He signed it. A do not resuscitate order. For me. While I lay there. Motionless. Silent. Trapped inside a body that wouldn't move, but a mind that heard every single word. I remember the sound of the monitor. Steady. Indifferent. Beep, beep, beep. Like nothing extraordinary was happening. Like my life hadn't just been reduced to a line item. A cost. A decision. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It didn't shatter. It went quiet. Completely quiet. Because when I finally opened my eyes, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I did something much worse. Something that would take everything he spent 40 years building and erase it in less than 24 hours. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story and drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? My name is Vanessa Clark. I'm 31 years old. And 3 weeks ago, my father tried to decide whether I was worth saving. This story doesn't start in the hospital. It starts long before that. It starts in a house where everything had a price, including love. Growing up, my father believed in investments. Not people. Investments. My older brother, Daniel, was his best return. Private school, $52,000 a year. Lacrosse coach, $8,500 a season. A brand new Audi on his 18th birthday with a red bow on the hood. He's going places, my father would say, clapping him on the back in front of guests, business partners, anyone who mattered. Me? I was the other one. Public school. Shared textbooks when budgets got tight. My first car was a 2009 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles and a passenger door that didn't open from the outside. It builds character, my father said when I asked why Daniel got more. I stopped asking after that. Not because I agreed. Because I understood something early. In our house, questions had consequences. So I learned to observe instead. Quietly. Carefully. I watched how decisions were made. I watched how money moved. I watched how contracts worked when my father brought paperwork home from his construction company and spread it across the dining table. Numbers never lied. People did. And numbers made sense to me. By the time I was 17, I could read a contract faster than most of the junior managers at his firm. Not word for word. Pattern for pattern. Risk. Liability. Exposure. Things he never thought I understood. Things he never bothered to teach me. Because, in his mind, I wasn't the investment worth making. Vanessa's practical, he'd say when relatives asked about me. She'll figure something out. Figure something out. That was the extent of his expectation. No college fund waiting. No introductions. No doors opened. Just figure it out. And I did. State University. Full-time job at a medical billing office to cover tuition. $18 an hour. 40 hours a week. Classes at night. Sleep when I could. I learned the healthcare system the same way I learned everything else. By watching. By listening. By connecting patterns no one else noticed. Insurance codes. Billing discrepancies. Loopholes buried in policy language. What gets approved? What gets denied? And more importantly, why? It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. It didn't get applause at family dinners. But it gave me something my father never realized I had. Leverage. The accident happened on a Tuesday. 7:42 p.m. I remember the time because it was the last thing I saw on my dashboard before everything went white. Not pain. Not chaos. Just absence. When I woke up, or whatever version of waking up that was, I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't open my eyes. But I could hear. Voices. Machines. Footsteps. And then him. My father. Standing at the foot of my hospital bed. Talking to a doctor, like they were discussing a delayed shipment or a budget overrun. What are we looking at here? He asked. Clinical. Detached. Severe complications, the doctor said carefully. She'll need surgery. There's a strong chance of recovery, but how much? My father cut him off. Not, will she be okay? Not, what are her chances? Just how much? A number was given. I don't remember the exact figure. I remember the silence after it. That kind of silence where a decision is being calculated. Not emotionally. Financially. And then he said it. Let her go.
We
Won't pay for the surgery.
just like that. No hesitation. No struggle.
Just a conclusion. As if I had already been written off. As if I'd never been anything more than a bad investment finally reaching its logical end. The doctor tried to push back. I could hear it in his tone. Careful. Professional. Sir, she's young. She has a strong chance. I understand, my father said, cutting him off again. But I'm not going to pour money into something with that kind of uncertainty. Something.
Not someone.
Something. And then the paper.
The pen.
The signature. The moment my life became a line, he decided to close. But here's the part he didn't know. The part no one knew. I heard everything. Every word. Every calculation. Every decision he made, thinking I wasn't there to witness it. And in that stillness, in that silence where I was supposed to fade quietly out of existence, I made a decision of my own. Not in anger. Not in panic. Something colder than that. Something precise. If my life was just a transaction to him, then I was going to show him exactly how expensive I could become. And I was going to do it without raising my voice, without asking for anything, without giving him a single warning. Because the most dangerous thing in that hospital room that night wasn't the machine keeping me alive. It was the fact that I was still thinking, still listening, still learning. And when I finally opened my eyes 3 days later, I made sure of one thing. I looked straight at him, held his gaze, and said nothing at all. I did not ask him why he signed it. I did not ask him what it cost. I did not ask him if there was even a moment, even a second, where he hesitated. Because I already knew the answer. The moment I opened my eyes, he smiled. Not relieved. Not emotional. Controlled. Measured. The kind of smile you give when a situation does not go according to plan, but you recover fast enough to pretend it never mattered. Vanessa, he said, stepping closer to the bed, hands in his coat pockets like he was standing at a job site instead of beside his daughter. You gave us quite a scare. A scare. That was the word he chose. Not accident. Not emergency.
Not.
The 3 days I spent suspended between decisions he had already made for me. Just a scare. I looked at him, held his gaze the same way I did when I was a kid, and learned that speaking only made things worse. Silence had always been safer. Silence had always been where I did my best thinking. The doctor stood on the other side of the room, clipboard in hand, watching both of us carefully. There was something in his expression. Not pity. Not exactly. Something closer to awareness. Like he knew there was more in that room than what was being said out loud. You are very lucky, he told me. There were complications. But you are stable now.
Lucky.
I almost smiled at that. Lucky would have been having a father who asked how I was before asking how much it cost. Lucky would have been not knowing what I knew. Instead, I nodded once. Slow. Controlled. Playing the role they expected.
Weak.
Recovering. Unaware. My father exhaled quietly, like a problem had resolved itself without requiring further investment. Good, he said. Then we can focus on getting you discharged as soon as possible. There it was again. Efficiency. Timeline. Cost management. Not healing. Not recovery. Discharge. I let the silence stretch. Let it sit between us until it became uncomfortable. He shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. He did not like silence unless he controlled it. That had always been his weakness. At 8 years old, I learned that if I stayed quiet long enough, people would reveal more than they intended. At 12, I learned that adults filled silence with truth. At 21, working in medical billing, I learned that systems did the same thing. Leave a gap, and something always surfaced to fill it. We will need to review your insurance coverage, the doctor said, flipping a page on his clipboard. There are still procedures recommended for full recovery. My father did not look at me when he answered. Send me the details, he said. I will evaluate. Evaluate. Not approve. Not commit. Evaluate. Just like he evaluated everything else in his life.
People.
Opportunities.
Risk. Return.
I closed my eyes for a moment, not from exhaustion, from calculation, because something did not add up. If he had signed a do not resuscitate order, if he had already decided not to proceed with treatment, then why was he still here? Why was he still involved? There were only two possibilities. Either he had changed his mind, or something had changed the outcome without his permission. And I knew my father well enough to understand one thing. He did not change his mind. Not once a decision had been made. That meant the second option. Something had interrupted his plan. Something, or someone. The door opened softly. A nurse stepped in. Mid-50s, steady presence, the kind of person who did not rush even in a room full of urgency. I need to run a quick check, she said gently, moving toward the monitors. She did not look at my father first. She looked at me, and for just a second there was recognition. Not of who I was, of what had happened. Subtle, controlled, but unmistakable. She adjusted the line at my arm, checked the readings, then leaned in slightly closer than necessary. You are doing better than expected, she said quietly. Then even softer just for me. Some things changed at the last minute. A pause. Barely a breath. Then she stepped back like nothing had happened. My father did not notice. He was already checking his phone, thumb scrolling through emails, numbers, something more important than the room he was standing in. But I noticed. And that was enough. Because now I knew there was a missing piece. A variable he had not accounted for. And if there was one thing I had learned working inside systems, it was this. The most powerful leverage does not come from what is visible. It comes from what almost happened and who stopped it. The nurse finished her check and walked toward the door, but not before placing a small folded piece of paper on the side table next to my bed. Casual. Intentional. Invisible to anyone not paying attention. I did not reach for it immediately. That would have been a mistake. Instead, I waited. Let time pass. Let my father finish his performance. He stayed another 7 minutes. I counted. 7 minutes of controlled concern, measured questions, and logistical planning. Then he left, already moving on to the next thing that required his attention. The door closed. Silence returned. Real silence this time. Not the kind he filled. The kind that belonged to me. Slowly, I turned my head, just enough to see the paper. My hand moved carefully, deliberately, like I was still weaker than I actually felt. I picked it up, unfolded it. One line, written in clean, precise handwriting. He signed it at 9:14 p.m. It was reversed at 9:22 p.m. Ask for the chart. 8 minutes. That was the difference between my life ending quietly and me opening my eyes in that room. 8 minutes, and someone had intervened. My fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Not enough to show, just enough to feel. Because this was not just information. This was proof. A timestamp, a decision, a reversal, a system that had recorded everything he thought would disappear. And in that moment, lying in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that reduced life to numbers and signals, I understood something with absolute clarity. He did not lose me. He almost did. And that almost was going to cost him everything. I did not call the nurse back. I did not press the button. I did not ask any questions out loud. Because questions leave traces. And I had just been handed something far more valuable than answers. I had been handed a timeline. 9:14 p.m.
A signature.
9:22 p.m. A reversal. 8 minutes. That was all it took for my life to shift from a closed decision to an open problem. I folded the paper again.
Slowly. Precisely.
Then slid it under the thin hospital blanket beside my leg where no one would think to look. My breathing stayed even. My expression stayed neutral. But inside, everything was moving. Not fast. Not chaotic. Just aligning. The same way it always did when I found a pattern. Because this was not just about what he did. It was about what he tried to finalize. A do not resuscitate order is not casual paperwork. It is documented. Time-stamped.
Witnessed. Filed.
and more importantly, reversible only under very specific conditions. Which meant one thing. Someone had intervened with authority. Not emotion. Not sympathy.
Authority.
And that meant there was a record. Somewhere in that hospital system, there was a version of events my father did not control. And if I could access it, I would not need to argue. I would not need to accuse. I would just need to present it. The next morning, the doctor returned. Same calm tone. Same measured steps.
But this
time, I watched him more carefully. Not just what he said, but what he avoided. We will begin reducing your medications today, he explained. You are progressing well. I nodded once. Then I did something I had not done yet. I spoke. My voice was quiet, slightly rough, exactly as expected. Can I see my chart?
A pause. Small.
Almost invisible. But I saw it. Doctors do not hesitate when patients ask routine questions. This was not routine. Of course, he said, too quickly. We can arrange that. Arrange. Not provide. That told me everything I needed to know. There was something in that chart that required management, not disclosure. I let my eyes drift slightly, like the effort of speaking had already taken too much out of me. Then I added, softer. I work in medical billing. Another pause. Longer this time, because now the context had changed. I was not just a patient. I was someone who understood how records worked, how codes aligned with actions, how timestamps told stories no one could rewrite. He nodded slowly. I will make sure you have access, he said. This time more careful, more deliberate.
Good.
That meant the system was still intact. And systems do not lie. Not when you know where to look. My father did not return that morning. Or the afternoon.
Or the next day.
Which, in a strange way, was the most honest thing he had done so far. Presence had never been his strength. Control was. And right now, he did not have it. Not fully. Not anymore. On the third day after I woke up, a tablet was placed on the rolling tray beside my bed. Your medical records, the nurse said. The same nurse. The one who had left the note. She did not look at me directly this time. She did not need to. The message had already been delivered. This was the follow-through. I waited until the room was empty, until the hallway sounds faded into background noise. Then I turned the screen toward me, logged in, and started reading. Not everything. That would have been a mistake. Too much information creates noise. I went straight to what mattered. Orders. Authorization. Timestamps. 9:14 p.m. There it was. Do not resuscitate. Signed by my father. Digital confirmation.
Witnessed. Filed. Clean.
Final. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment. Not because I was shocked, but because seeing it made it real in a way hearing it never could. This was not something I imagined. Not something I misunderstood. This was a decision recorded in a system designed to outlast memory. Then I scrolled. 9:22 p.m. Order reversed. Authorized by attending physician. Justification, patient status reassessed. A reassessment. That was the official explanation. Neutral. Clinical. Safe. But the gap between those two entries, that was where the truth lived. 8 minutes that did not align with my father's version of reality. 8 minutes that someone had disrupted his control. I leaned back slightly against the pillow, letting the information settle. Because now I had confirmation. Not emotion. Not suspicion. Confirmation. And confirmation is leverage. But leverage is only useful if you understand how to apply it. I scrolled further. Billing codes. Insurance pre-authorization. Notes from administration. And then, I found it. A pending life insurance notification. Filed at 9:18 p.m. For minutes after he signed the order. My breath slowed. Not stopped. Not rushed. Just slower. Because now the pattern was complete. He did not just decide not to save me. He moved to claim before the outcome was final. That was not hesitation. That was strategy. A calculated sequence. Decision. Documentation. Financial action. He did not wait to see what would happen. He positioned himself for what he expected to happen. And that changed everything. Because this was no longer about a father making a cold decision. This was about intent, about timing, about actions that connected in a way no one could explain as coincidence. I closed the tablet, gently, carefully, like I had just finished reading something that required no reaction. Because reactions invite interference. And I was not ready for that. Not yet. I needed time. Time to recover. Time to observe. Time to let him believe that whatever he had done was still buried under silence. Because the most effective move is not the first one. It is the one they never see coming. And right now he still thought I was weak. Still thought I was recovering. Still thought I had no idea what almost happened in that room. I rested my head back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor again. Beep, beep, beep.
Same sound.
Same room.
But
everything had changed. Because now, I was not just the patient in the bed. I was the only person in that building who understood exactly what those 8 minutes were worth. And I was going to collect on every single second of them. I did not confront him. Not when I had the chart. Not when I saw the insurance notification. Not even when the pattern became so clear it felt like it was written in bold across every line of that record. Because confrontation is emotional. And emotion is unpredictable. I needed precision. I needed control. And most importantly, I needed him to stay exactly where he was. Comfortable. Confident. Unaware. The 4th day after I woke up, he came back. Same coat. Same posture. Same measured presence, like he was stepping into a meeting instead of a hospital room. You are looking better, he said, standing at the foot of the bed again. Always the same position. Never too close. Never within reach. I studied him quietly. The way his eyes scanned the room before landing on me. The way his jaw tightened just slightly when he saw I was more alert than he expected. He had already adjusted. That was his instinct. Adapt quickly. Regain control. They are saying you might be discharged within the week, he continued. That is good. We can get things back to normal. Back to normal.
I almost asked him what that meant.
The version of normal where I stayed quiet, or the one where he decided whether I was worth saving. Instead, I said nothing. Just watched. Let the silence stretch again. He shifted his weight slightly. Not uncomfortable yet, but aware. We will need to discuss your recovery plan, he added. There are costs involved, so we need to be smart about it. There it was again.
Costs.
Not care. Not outcome. Just numbers. Always numbers. I nodded slowly, like I agreed. Like I understood. Like I was still the same version of myself he had always calculated around. That was important, because the moment he realized I had changed, he would adjust. And I was not ready for that yet. I trust your judgment, I said quietly. The words felt strange, not because they were untrue, but because of how he would hear them. Trust to him meant control. It meant compliance. It meant no resistance. I watched the shift happen in real time. His shoulders relaxed slightly. His tone softened just enough to feel like reassurance. Good, he said. That makes things easier. Easier.
Yes.
For him. That was the illusion I needed him to believe. That everything was still within his control. That whatever decision he had made in that room had not been seen. Had not been recorded. Had not been understood. Because people like him do not prepare for consequences they do not believe exist. He stayed longer this time. 15 minutes.
Talking about logistics.
About timelines. About how quickly I could return to work. He never asked how I felt. Never asked what I remembered. And that told me everything. He believed the narrative was intact. That the version of events he chose was the only one that mattered. When he left, I did not move right away. I let the room settle. Let the quiet return. Then I reached for the call button. Not urgently. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. A few minutes later, the nurse came in. The same one. Linda. That was the name on her badge. Linda Foster. She closed the door behind her before speaking.
Not all the way.
Just enough. You asked for your chart, she said softly. Did you find what you needed? I looked at her.
Really looked this time.
The steadiness in her posture. The way she chose her words carefully. She was not guessing. She knew exactly what I had seen. I found the timestamps. I said. My voice was still quiet, but there was something else in it now. Something firmer. 8 minutes, she replied. Not a question. A confirmation. I nodded once. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why was it reversed? A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. She stepped closer to the side of the bed, lowering her voice just enough that it would not carry beyond the door. Because it should not have been signed in the first place, she said. The attending physician did not authorize it initially. There were concerns. Concerns. That was the safe word. The institutional word. The word that covered everything without saying anything directly. And the insurance notification? I asked. Her eyes flickered slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. She had seen that too. That was flagged, she said carefully. It triggered a review. That is what delayed the process. Delayed. Not stopped. That distinction mattered. Because it meant the system had not acted out of morality. It had acted out of protocol. A discrepancy. A mismatch. Something that did not align with expected procedure. And that was what saved me. Not intention. Not compassion. A system catching an inconsistency. I let that settle for a moment, because it reinforced something I had always known. Systems do not care about people. They care about patterns. And if you understand the pattern, you control the outcome. Is there a record of the review? I asked. Linda held my gaze for a second longer this time, measuring, deciding. Then she nodded. There is, she said. But it is not something patients usually request. Usually. That word again. The assumption that I would follow the expected path. Ask the expected questions. Accept the expected answers. I shook my head slightly. I am not a usual case. That was the closest I had come to stating the truth out loud. She did not argue. Did not correct me. She simply reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small folded form. Not official. Not printed with hospital headers. Just a reference number written clearly across the top. If you request this, she said, placing it on the tray beside me, they will have to provide it. Have to. Not might. Not could. Have to. That was what I needed. Not access. Obligation. Because obligation creates accountability. And accountability creates consequences. I looked down at the number. Memorized it instantly. Then folded the paper and slid it beneath the same spot under the blanket where the first note had gone. Layering information. Building structure. Piece by piece. Linda straightened slightly, her expression returning to neutral professionalism. You should rest, she said, stepping back toward the door. Recovery takes time. Recovery. I almost smiled at that. Because what I was doing had nothing to do with recovery. It had to do with reconstruction. Rebuilding a narrative. Not the one he created. The one the system recorded. The one that could not be dismissed. Could not be rewritten. Could not be negotiated away. As the door closed behind her, I leaned back against the pillow again, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Same room. Same steady rhythm of the monitor. But now the structure was complete. Timeline. Signature. Reversal. Insurance trigger. Internal review. Each piece connected. Each piece reinforcing the next. This was no longer an incident. It was a sequence. And sequences can be proven. I closed my eyes slowly. Not to sleep. To think. Because the next step was not about gathering more information. It was about deciding when to use it. Timing was everything. And right now he still believed I was recovering. Still believed I was dependent. Still believed the version of me in that bed was the only version that existed. That was his mistake. Because the person lying here silent still watching was not the daughter he calculated around. She was the one who had just learned exactly how he made decisions. And more importantly, exactly how to take them away from him. I did not rush. That was the first rule. The moment you rush, you lose control. And control was the only thing that mattered now. On the 6th day, they moved me out of the ICU. A smaller room. Less noise. Fewer machines. More space to think. That was the real difference. Not the equipment. The silence. ICU silence is controlled. Monitored. Observed. This silence belonged to me. My father approved the transfer within minutes.
Of course he did.
ICU care costs more. Private rooms cost less. Even in something as small as a room change, his pattern stayed consistent. Reduce exposure. Minimize cost. Maintain control. I let him handle the paperwork. I let him sign whatever needed to be signed. I let him believe he was still making decisions for me. Because every signature he placed, every authorization he controlled added another layer to the pattern I was building. And patterns are strongest when they are consistent. The afternoon after I was transferred, a case manager came in. Mid-30s.
Polished.
Efficient. The kind of person who spoke in structured sentences and avoided anything that sounded like speculation. We are coordinating your discharge plan, she said, tablet in hand. Physical therapy, follow-up appointments, and billing reconciliation. Billing. That word always revealed more than people intended. I nodded slightly, keeping my tone soft. Can I review the billing summary before discharge? A simple request. Reasonable. Expected. But again, there was that pause. That half-second where something behind her professional expression shifted. Of course, she said. We will prepare that for you.
Prepare.
Not provide. That meant filtering. Adjusting. Managing what I would see, which meant the raw version contained something they did not want to explain. Good. That meant I was getting closer. And the insurance claim, I added, just enough to sound like I was trying to understand, not investigate. Has that been submitted? This time, the pause was longer. There was an initial notification, she said carefully, but it was flagged for review and has not been processed.
Flagged.
The same word Linda used. The same point in the sequence. The moment where the system interrupted his plan. I nodded again, like I was following along. Like I did not already know exactly when that notification had been filed. I just want to make sure everything is accurate, I said. I work in billing, so I know how easy it is for things to get misaligned. Misaligned. Her eyes flickered slightly at that. Because that word carried weight. It meant discrepancy. It meant review. It meant liability. We will ensure everything is correct, she said. But her tone had changed. More cautious now. Less automatic. Because now, I was no longer just a patient asking questions. I was someone who understood the consequences of the answers. After she left, I did not touch the call button. I did not open the tablet. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sequence again. 9:14, 9:18, 9:22.
Signature.
Notification. Reversal. 3 points. 3 actions. All within 8 minutes. That was not random. That was a chain. And chains can be broken. Or used. Later that evening, my father called.
Not a visit this time.
A call. That told me something had shifted. When people move from physical presence to distance, it usually means one of two things. They're busy. Or they are avoiding something. With him, it was never just one. How are you feeling? He asked. Same tone. Controlled. Neutral. I let a small pause settle before answering. Better. Short. Minimal. Exactly what he expected. Good, he said. They told me you are being discharged soon. There it was again. Focus on outcome, not process. That is what they said. Another pause. Then he moved to what actually mattered to him. We will need to review your insurance coverage once you are out. There are still costs and we need to be strategic about how we handle them. Strategic. That word again. Everything to him was a strategy. Even this. Even me.
I.
Let my breathing stay even. Let my voice remain soft. I understand. And then, I added something new. Something small. Something that did not sound like much but would shift everything. I would like to handle my own billing moving forward. Silence. Not long. But enough. Enough for me to hear the recalculation happening on his end. This was new. This was not the version of me he was used to.
There is no need for that, he said.
I can manage it. Of course he could. That was the point. Control. Visibility. Access. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. I know you can, I said. But this is my field. It would be easier for me. Easier. Not better. Not necessary. Easier.
Non-threatening.
Practical. That was the key. Never challenge him directly. Redirect. Reframe. Let him believe the decision aligned with his logic. There was another pause. Longer this time. Then,
Fine, he said.
if that is what you prefer. Prefer. Not decide. Not choose. Prefer. That was as close as he would get to acknowledging a shift in control. And that was enough. Because now, I had it. Access to the billing. Direct oversight of the claims. Visibility into every transaction connected to what happened in that hospital room. And most importantly, the ability to see what he tried to initiate before the system stopped him. I will send you the documents once you are discharged, he added. We will go through everything together. Together. That word almost made me smile. Because he still thought this was a collaboration. Still thought we were on the same side of the table. He had no idea. I had already moved to the other side. That sounds good, I said.
Calm.
Even. Controlled. The call ended a few seconds later.
No emotion. No tensión.
Just closure. The way all of our conversations had always been. I placed the phone back on the table beside me and closed my eyes for a moment. Not to rest. To lock it in. Every word. Every shift. Every small change in tone. Because now the structure was no longer just internal. It was expanding. From hospital records to billing systems to insurance claims. The same pattern moving through different layers. And I was following it. Not chasing. Not forcing. Just tracking.
Piece by piece.
Because the truth was, I did not need to prove what he did. The system had already recorded it. I just needed to make sure it was seen. And when it was, there would be no version of the story he could control. Only the one he created in 8 minutes that he thought would disappear. And the one I was about to make impossible to ignore. Discharge day came quietly.
No announcement. No dramatic shift.
Just a clipboard, a signature, and a nurse handing me a folder like this was any other routine exit. That was the thing about systems. They do not recognize turning points. They only recognize completion. And to them this was just another case closing. I dressed slowly. Not because I needed to. Because I wanted to feel every movement. Every step of leaving that room where everything had almost ended and something else had begun. The hallway felt different without the machines. Without the constant rhythm of monitored life. Just footsteps. Voices. The distant hum of a building that processed hundreds of stories at once, without remembering any of them. Except this one would not be forgotten. Not if I did this right. My father was waiting near the exit. Of course he was. Timing mattered to him. Appear present at the right moment, and it looks like you were there all along. Ready? He asked, holding the door open. I nodded once.
No hesitation.
No resistance. Just the version of me he expected. Compliant. Recovering. Manageable. The car ride was quiet. He did not fill the silence this time. That told me something. He was thinking. Adjusting. Trying to anticipate variables he could not yet define.
Good.
That meant he felt it too. Something had shifted. He just did not know what. His house looked exactly the same. Clean lines. Neutral colors. Everything in its place.
No clutter. No excess.
Just controlled space. Controlled environment. Controlled narrative. You can stay in the guest room while you recover, he said as we walked in. Guest room. Not my room. Not home. Temporary. That distinction was intentional. Everything with him was. That works, I replied, setting my bag down carefully. He watched me for a second longer than usual. Not suspicious. Observant. Like he was trying to confirm that nothing had changed. I kept my movement steady. My tone even.
No sudden shifts. No signals.
Because right now, invisibility was power. The first thing I did after he left the room was not rest. It was open the folder the hospital gave me. Discharge summary. Medication list. Follow-up appointments.
Standard.
Predictable. But at the back, billing. Preliminary charges. Not final. Not processed. But enough to outline the structure. I scanned it quickly. Room charges. Procedure codes. Monitoring. And then, I saw it. A line item marked pending review. Insurance hold. That was the echo of those 8 minutes. Still present. Still unresolved. I closed the folder slowly and set it aside. Because the hospital records were only one layer. The next layer was external. Insurance systems. Claims processing. Financial movement. That was where decisions became consequences. Later that evening, he brought in a stack of documents. Organized.
Tapped. Prepared.
Of course he did. These are the insurance and billing documents, he said, placing them on the table in front of me. We should go through them. Should. Not need. Not must. Just should. I sat down across from him. Same position as always. Opposite sides of the table. He slid the first document toward me. Coverage summary. Deductibles. Out-of-pocket limits. He started explaining. Methodical. Controlled. Like he was walking me through something I could not understand on my own. I let him talk. Let him explain. Let him build the narrative he wanted me to accept. Because the more he spoke, the more gaps appeared. The claim has not been processed yet, he said, flipping to the next page. There were some delays, but that is normal. Normal. That word again. Used to smooth over anything that might raise questions. I nodded slightly. Then I reached for the document myself. Turned it just enough to read the header clearly. Claim initiation timestamp. 9:18 p.m. There it was. Not hidden. Not erased. Just sitting there. Waiting to be noticed by someone who knew what it meant. I let my finger rest near the line.
Not pointing.
Not highlighting. Just close enough. This was submitted quickly, I said softly. Not accusatory. Not surprised. Just observational. His eyes flickered to the timestamp for a fraction of a second. Then back to me. Controlled. Immediate recovery. That is standard procedure, he said. Hospitals notify insurance early. Early. Not immediate. Not within 4 minutes of a life-ending decision. Early. I nodded again. Let the silence settle. Then I turned. The page. And this was flagged. I added, my voice still calm. Still neutral. He leaned back slightly in his chair. Not defensive. Not yet. But aware. Yes, he said. That happens sometimes. System checks. Nothing unusual. Nothing unusual. That was the second time he used that phrase. Repetition always reveals intent. I looked up at him. Held his gaze for just a second longer than before. Not challenging. Just present. I would like to follow up on the review, I said. Directly. There it was. The shift. Small. Controlled. But undeniable. This was no longer passive. No longer guided by him. This was me, stepping into the process. His jaw tightened slightly. Almost invisible. But I saw it. That is not necessary, he said. They will resolve it. Resolve. Passive. External. Remove control from me, return it to him. I shook my head gently. I prefer to understand it myself. Prefer. Not insist. Not demand. Prefer. That was the language he respected. Choice framed as logic. Not emotion. He studied me for a moment, longer this time, measuring, recalculating, trying to determine if this was temporary or something else. Then he nodded.
Once. Fine, he said.
If you want to look into it, go ahead. There it was. Permission. Not control. Not oversight. Just permission. And that was the moment everything changed. Because now, I was not just observing the system. I was inside it, with access, with context, with a sequence already mapped out. I gathered the documents neatly, aligned them carefully, just like he always did, mirroring his behavior, reinforcing the illusion that nothing fundamental had shifted. But inside, the structure was complete. Hospital record, timestamp, insurance notification, flagged review, each piece connected, each piece reinforcing the next. This was no longer about what he said, or what he explained. It was about what the system recorded. And systems do not forget. I looked down at the documents one last time before closing the folder. Then I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting a small pause settle between us.
Calm.
Measured. Controlled. Exactly the way he had always operated. The only difference now was that I was no longer part of his system. I was building my own. And he was already inside it, without even realizing it. I did not start with the insurance company. That would have been too direct. Too obvious.
And obvious. Moves get blocked.
Instead, I started where systems are weakest. Not in the decisions, but in the communication between them. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet. Completely still. My father's world did not begin until 8:30. Emails. Calls. Meetings. Structured time. Predictable flow. Mine started earlier. I sat at the small desk in the guest room, the folder open in front of me. Every document aligned perfectly. Not because I needed it to be, because it helped me think. Order creates clarity, and clarity reveals leverage. I picked up my phone and dialed the hospital billing department. Not the general line. The direct extension listed at the bottom of the discharge summary. The one most people ignore, because it requires knowing what to ask for. Billing services, a voice answered. Neutral. Routine. I kept my tone soft. Controlled. Hi, my name is Vanessa Clark. I was recently discharged, and I need to request the internal review documentation tied to a flagged insurance notification. Silence. Not long, but enough. Because that was not a standard request. Let me pull up your file, she said. Keys clicking in the background.
A pause.
Then, there is a review attached. It is restricted. Restricted. That word mattered. Restricted means it exists. It is just not meant to be easily accessed. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my voice stay calm. I understand. I am requesting it under patient record access. Full disclosure. Another pause. Longer this time, because now it was not a question of availability. It was a question of obligation. I will need to escalate that request, she said. It may take some time. Time. That was expected. That was part of the system protecting itself. I nodded, even though she could not see me. That is fine, I said. Please note the request was made today. Document the moment. Always document the moment, because timestamps are everything. I ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk.
No emotion. No urgency.
Just progression. Step 1. Initiated. By 9:15, I made the second call. This one to the insurance company. Different tone. Different structure. But the same approach.
Calm. Precise.
Controlled. I need to verify the status of a claim flagged for review, I said, giving them the reference number. The representative pulled it up. I could hear the shift. In her breathing. Subtle. But there. This claim is currently under investigation, she said carefully. Investigation. Not review. Not delay. Investigation. That was a stronger word. A more permanent one. I let a small pause settle before responding. Can you tell me what triggered the investigation? Another pause. This one, heavier. Because now I was asking about causality, not status. There was a discrepancy between the authorization and the timing of the notification, she said. Clean. Clinical. But clear. A discrepancy. Between authorization and timing. Exactly what I had already mapped out. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not from surprise. From confirmation. Because hearing it from a second system made it undeniable. Will I be notified of the outcome? I asked. Yes, she said. As the policyholder, you will receive full documentation once the investigation is complete. Full documentation. That was what I needed. Not partial. Not summarized. Full. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat there in the quiet, letting it all settle. Because now the structure was no longer internal. It was active. The hospital had a record. The insurance company had an investigation. Two separate systems, both triggered by the same 8 minutes. And neither of them under his control. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. Morning light was just starting to fill the street. Soft. Gradual. Like nothing urgent was happening. Like everything was still normal. That was the illusion. And illusions are most powerful right before they break. Behind me, I heard movement. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. My father. Right on schedule. 8:30. I turned back to the desk, closing the folder halfway. Not hiding it. Just not presenting it. When he stepped into the doorway, his expression was neutral, controlled. But there was something else now. A slight edge. A subtle awareness that something had shifted even if he could not define it. "You're up early," he said. I nodded once. Could not sleep. Simple. Believable. He glanced at the documents on the desk, then back at me. "Have you started reviewing the billing?" he asked. There it was. Casual. But targeted. He wanted to know how far I had gone. How much I had seen. How much control he still had. I kept my tone even. Just the basics. Not a lie. Not the full truth. Just enough to maintain the balance. He stepped further into the room, crossing the space slowly. Not rushed. Not hesitant. Just deliberate. "If you have questions, you should bring them to me," he said. "It is easier that way." Easier. For him. Not for me. I met his gaze.
Calm. Steady.
"I made a few calls this morning," I said. And then, I stopped. Let the sentence hang. Let the silence do what it always does. Force him to fill it. His expression did not change immediately, but his eyes sharpened. Just slightly. "What kind of calls?" he asked. There it was. The shift from control to inquiry. Subtle, but real. I leaned back in the chair, keeping my posture relaxed.
Billing.
"Insurance," I said. Simple.
Direct. No emotion. No accusation.
Just information. He nodded slowly. Too slowly.
Processing.
Recalculating. Adjusting. That was not necessary, he said. His tone was still controlled. But the edge was clearer now. I shook my head gently. I prefer to understand it myself. The same phrase. The same framing. Consistency builds credibility. And credibility limits resistance. He studied me for a moment longer. Then he did something he had not done yet. He did not correct me. He did not redirect. He did not take control back. He just nodded.
Once.
"All right," he said. But the word felt different this time. Not agreement. Not approval. Recognition. Because somewhere in that moment he understood something. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that the version of me sitting in that chair was not the one he had calculated for. And that was the beginning of the end. I looked down at the documents again, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the folder.
Calm.
Still. Controlled. Exactly the way he had always been. The only difference now was that I was no longer reacting to his system. I was activating mine. And it had already started moving before he even realized he was part of it. The next 48 hours were quiet. Too quiet. No calls from the hospital. No updates from the insurance company.
No interruptions.
Just silence. But this was not empty silence. This was pressure building. Because systems do not respond instantly. They verify. They cross-check. They escalate. And when they do it all at once. I did not sit and wait. Waiting is passive. And passive people get caught off guard. Instead, I moved to the next layer. People. Not emotional allies. Not friends.
Professionals.
Individuals connected to the systems already in motion. Because this was not something I could execute alone. Not effectively. Not completely. That afternoon, I sent one email. Not long. Not detailed. Just enough. Subject line. Documentation inquiry. Case review reference attached.
Direct.
Neutral. Professional. The recipient, a legal consultant who specialized in insurance disputes. Someone I had worked with briefly 2 years ago when a billing case escalated beyond internal resolution. I did not explain everything. That would have been a mistake. Too much information reduces leverage. Instead, I attached the reference number Linda had given me, the insurance claim number, and one sentence. I believe there is a timing discrepancy tied to an authorization and claim initiation. I would like your perspective. Perspective. Not help. Not advice. Perspective. Language matters. Within 3 hours, I received a response. We should speak. This is not a standard discrepancy. Not standard. That was the second independent confirmation. The first from insurance. The second from someone outside both systems. That meant the pattern was not just visible. It was abnormal. I scheduled the call for the next morning. Not immediately. Never immediately. Urgency creates attention. And attention invites interference. That night, my father stayed in his office longer than usual.
The door closed.
The light on. Calls one after another. I did not need to hear the words. The rhythm was enough. Short calls. Then longer ones. Then silence. Then another call. That was not routine business. That was reaction. Something had reached him. Not everything. Not the full structure. But enough to disrupt his balance.
Good.
That meant the system had started moving on his end as well. The next morning, I took the call at the same desk. Same posture. Same controlled environment. Walk me through the sequence, the consultant said.
No introduction.
No small talk. Straight to structure. I outlined it cleanly. Timestamp. Authorization. Claim initiation. Reversal. Flagged review.
No emotion. No speculation.
Just facts. There was a pause on the other end. Then, if those timestamps hold, he said slowly, this is not just a discrepancy. This is exposure. Exposure. Not error. Not issue. Exposure. I leaned back slightly, letting the words settle. In what sense? I asked. Even though I already knew. He exhaled quietly, initiating a financial claim based on an outcome that has not been finalized while holding decision authority over that outcome creates a conflict. Conflict. Another controlled word. But underneath it, liability. And if it is proven? I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. More certain. Then it becomes actionable. Actionable. That was the word I had been building toward. Not emotional. Not personal. Legal. Structural. Final. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat there, hands resting lightly on the desk, letting everything align. Because now, I had it. Not just information. Not just confirmation. A path. Clear. Defined. Irreversible once initiated. And that was the difference. Up until now, everything had been observation. Preparation. Structure. But from this point forward, every move would have consequences. Not just for him.
For me as well.
Because once this started, there would be no going back to silence. No returning to the version of this story where nothing happened. I stood up slowly and walked to the window again. Morning light. Same street. Same stillness. But everything felt sharper. Like the edges of reality had been defined more clearly. Behind me, I heard his office door open. Footsteps. Slower this time. He was thinking, calculating, adjusting. When he appeared in the doorway, his expression was different. Not controlled. Not neutral. Focused. We need to talk, he said. There it was.
Direct. No framing. No softening.
Just intent. I turned from the window and faced him.
Calm.
Still. About what? I asked. Even though I knew. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him this time. That was new. Doors in his world were usually left open. Visibility. Transparency. Control. Closing it meant containment. The insurance claim, he said. There has been a delay.
Delay.
Not investigation. Not discrepancy.
Delay.
His version of the narrative. I nodded once. I am aware, I said. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In focus. How? He asked.
Simple. Direct.
The question behind the question. How much do you know? I held his gaze. Let the silence stretch just long enough to matter. Then I answered. I made a few calls. The same phrase. Same tone. But this time it landed differently. Because now he understood what it meant. His jaw tightened. Just slightly. That was not your place, he said. There it was. Not concern. Not confusion. Control.
Challenged.
I tilted my head. Just enough to acknowledge the statement, without accepting it. It is my claim, I said.
Calm.
Even. Final. A pause. Longer this time. Because now we were no longer operating in the same structure. He was trying to reassert control. I was redefining it. You do not understand how these systems work, he said. That was his fallback.
Undermine.
Reframe. Re-establish authority. I almost smiled. Not outwardly. Internally. Because that was the one assumption that would cost him everything. I understand enough, I replied. Quiet. Steady. Controlled. And then, I said nothing else. Because silence forces the truth to surface. And right now, the truth was this. He no longer knew what I knew. He no longer controlled what I would do. And for the first time in his perfectly structured, carefully managed world, there was something he could not predict. I watched it register. Slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. And in that moment, I knew the system had settled. Then I added just enough. What about timing combined with authorization? He stopped, just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Enough to see the recalculation happen. Because now, I was no longer asking general questions. I was connecting variables. It still depends on context, he said, slower this time. More careful. You cannot draw conclusions from isolated data points. Isolated. That was the word he chose. Because if the points remained isolated, they were harmless. But if they connected, they became something else entirely. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting my posture stay relaxed. I agree, I said. Isolated data points do not mean much. And then, I stopped. Let the silence stretch. Let the weight of what I did not say fill the space. He watched me. Closely now. Not just observing. Assessing. Trying to determine how far I had gone. How much I had already connected. That was the moment I needed. Not confrontation. Not exposure. Confirmation. Because the way he responded next would tell me everything. Where exactly did you get this information? He asked. There it was. Not denial. Not dismissal. Source control. That meant one thing. He knew there was something there. He just did not know how much I had access to. I kept my expression neutral. The same place anyone would, I said. The records. Not a lie. Not the full truth. Just enough to keep the balance. His jaw tightened again. Slightly more visible this time. Those records can be misinterpreted, he said. Without proper context, they do not tell the full story. Context. Another controlled word. Another attempt to reshape the narrative. I nodded slowly. Then what is the full story? I asked. And then, I waited. Because that was the trap. Not aggressive. Not obvious. Just open. If he explained, he would reveal. If he avoided, he would confirm. Either way, I would learn something. He did not answer immediately. For the first time since I woke up, he hesitated. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But enough. Enough for me to see that this was no longer a conversation he could control completely. The full story, he said finally, is that decisions were made based on the information available at the time. Safe. General. Non-specific. No details.
No timestamps.
No sequence. Just distance. I almost smiled. Because that told me everything.
He was
not denying the sequence.
He was avoiding it.
Which meant the sequence was real. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the desk. Not aggressive. Just engaged. Information available at 9:14? I asked. Quiet. Precise. His eyes locked onto mine. Sharper now. Focused. This was no longer a general discussion. This was specific. Measured. Controlled. Vanessa, he said, his tone shifting slightly. You are overanalyzing this. Overanalyzing. That was his last defense. Dismiss the pattern before it becomes undeniable. I held his gaze. Steady. Unmoving. Am I? I asked. And then, I said nothing else. Because silence is where pressure builds. Seconds passed. Not many, but enough. Enough for the air in the room to change. Enough for him to feel it. The loss of control. Not complete. Not yet. But enough to matter. He exhaled slowly. Then straightened slightly, resetting his posture. This is not productive, he said. You need to focus on recovery. Recovery. Return to baseline. Return to silence. Return to the version of me that did not ask questions. I nodded once. Calm. Accepting. I said. And then I leaned back again, letting the tension dissolve just enough. Not completely. Just enough. Because pushing further now would have been too soon. Too obvious. Timing was everything. And this was not the moment to expose the full structure. This was the moment to let him believe he had contained it. He studied me for a second longer. Then he nodded.
Once. Good, he said.
And just like that, the conversation ended. He turned and walked out of the room, the door closing softly behind him. I did not move right away. I stayed exactly where I was, eyes fixed on the desk in front of me, breathing steady, mind clear, because now I had what I needed. Not proof. Not yet. But confirmation. He knew. Not everything. But enough to be careful. And that meant one thing. The window was closing. Slowly. Quietly. But closing. Which meant my next move had to be precise. Final. Irreversible. I reached for the folder again, opening it to the same page. The timestamp. 9:18. The line that connected everything. And I traced it lightly with my finger. Not because I needed to see it again. Because I needed to feel it. The exact moment where his decision crossed from internal to external.
From
thought to action. From control to exposure. That was the moment that would break him. Not the signature. Not the conversation. The action. The claim. The attempt to finalize an outcome before it was real. I closed the folder slowly and leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting toward the window. The light had shifted. Brighter now. Clearer. Like the day had fully arrived. And with it, the next phase. Because everything up to this point had been preparation. Observation. Structure. But now it was time to act. Not emotionally. Not impulsively.
Precisely.
The same way he had made his decision. The same way he had signed that order.
Calm.
Controlled. Certain. The only difference was that my decision would not be reversed. The decision was not a moment. It was a sequence. One that had to be executed without hesitation, without emotion, and most importantly, without visibility until it was already complete. I did not start with him. I started with the system. Because systems do not argue. They do not defend. They respond. And once they respond, they do not stop. That afternoon, I sent the second email. This one was different.
Not a request.
Not an inquiry. A submission. Attached, hospital record extract, timestamp confirmation, insurance claim initiation log, and the internal review reference number.
No commentary. No accusation.
Just documentation.
Clean.
Aligned. Irrefutable. Subject line. Formal submission. Timing discrepancy documentation.
Direct.
Final. Within an hour, I received confirmation. Not from a person. From the system itself. Case status updated. Escalation initiated. That was the moment the process became irreversible. Not because of what I said. Because of what the system now had to do. Review. Cross-reference. Validate. And once that began, it would reach every connected layer. Insurance compliance. Legal oversight. Financial audit. Each one pulling from the same sequence. Each one seeing the same 8 minutes. I closed my laptop slowly and leaned back in the chair, breathing steady.
No ruse. No tensión.
Because this part was no longer mine to control. It was already moving. That evening, my father did not come home at his usual time. 8:30 passed. 9:15. 10. When the front door finally opened, his footsteps were faster. Not rushed, but less controlled. He walked straight past the living room and into his office without saying a word. The door closed. Harder than usual. Not slammed, but enough to break the pattern. That was the first sign. The second came 20 minutes later. His voice.
Raised.
Not loud,
but sharp.
Controlled frustration. The kind he never allowed in normal situations. I already told you, there is no issue with the timing, he said. A pause. Someone else speaking on the other end. Then, no, that is being misinterpreted. Misinterpreted. The same word he used with me. The same attempt to reshape the narrative.
But now, it was not directed at me.
It was directed at the system. And the system does not accept reinterpretation. Only evidence. I did not move closer. I did not try to hear more. I did not need to. The pattern was already clear. The escalation had reached him. Faster than I expected. Which meant the discrepancy was not minor. It was significant enough to trigger immediate attention.
Good.
That meant the structure was holding. I returned to the guest room and closed the door softly behind me. Sat at the desk. Hands resting lightly on the surface. Still. Centered. Because now, I needed to think about the next phase. Not reaction. Not defense. Completion. The following morning, everything changed. Not gradually. Not subtly. Immediately. At 9:02 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Miss Clark, a voice said. Professional. Formal. This is Daniel Mercer from Insurance Compliance. We have reviewed your submission. Reviewed. Not pending. Not in process. Reviewed. That meant one thing. They moved fast. I sat up slightly, my posture aligning instinctively. Yes, I said. We have identified a sequence that requires further action, he continued. Careful, controlled, but clear. We will be initiating a formal investigation into the claim and associated authorization process. Formal investigation. There it was. Not internal. Not preliminary. Formal. Which meant documentation. Which meant accountability. Which meant consequences. I let a small pause settle before responding. What does that involve? I asked. Even though I already knew. We will be contacting all relevant parties, he said, including the hospital, attending physician, and the individual who authorized the initial order. The individual. Not my father. Not yet. Systems do not assign identity immediately. They assign roles. And then they connect them. You will be notified of all developments, he added. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat there, completely still. Because that was it. The point of no return. The moment where everything shifted from potential to process. From observation to consequence. And there was nothing he could do to stop it now. Not call. Not explain. Not reframe. Because the system was no longer listening to him. It was examining him. The door to my room opened suddenly.
No knock. No pause.
He stood there. Eyes sharper than I had ever seen them. Not controlled anymore. Focused.
Direct.
What did you do? He asked.
No greeting.
No context. Just accusation. I looked up at him.
Calm.
Unmoving. I submitted documentation, I said.
Simple. True.
Final. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him again. This time, harder. You escalated this, he said. Not a question. A statement. I nodded once. Yes.
No hesitation. No explanation.
Just confirmation. The silence that followed was different. Heavy.
Dense.
Not empty. Filled with everything he was calculating and everything he could not control. Do you understand what you have done? He asked.
His voice was lower now. Controlled again.
But tighter. I held his gaze.
Steady.
Yes, I said. And then, I stopped. Let the silence finish the sentence for me. Because what I had done did not need explanation. It needed time. Time for the system to move. Time for the sequence to complete. Time for every layer he relied on to turn against him. He stared at me for a moment longer. Then he said something I had never heard from him before. Not once. Not in my entire life. You should have come to me first.
Should have. Not could have. Not might have. Should have.
That was not control. That was regret. I almost felt something. Almost. But it passed. Because this was not about what he felt now.
It was about what he did then.
8 minutes. That was all it took for him to decide my life had a price. And now, the system was about to decide the cost of that decision. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands still resting calmly on the desk. You already made your decision, I said quietly. And then, I said nothing else. Because there was nothing left to say. Not here. Not in this room. Not between us. The rest would be handled by the system. And systems always finish what they start. The system did not explode. It did not announce itself.
It moved.
Quietly. Precisely. Like everything that actually matters. The first notice came that same afternoon. Not to me.
To him.
Certified. Documented. Delivered. I did not see the letter arrive, but I heard the sound of it hitting the table in his office. A sharper sound than usual. Thicker paper. Official. That kind of detail matters. Because systems signal their weight through form before they ever reveal content. He did not open it immediately. I knew that without seeing it. Because hesitation has a rhythm. And his rhythm changed. Slower footsteps. Longer pauses. Silence where there should have been movement. Then finally the tear of the envelope. Controlled. Careful. Like if he opened it gently enough, the contents might change. They did not. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A notification. Not from insurance this time. From the consultant. It has been escalated to formal audit. This is moving faster than expected. Faster than expected. That meant one thing. The discrepancy was not just valid. It was severe. I set the phone down slowly and looked toward the closed office door. No sound now. No calls.
No passing.
Just stillness. And stillness in someone like him is not calm. It is containment. The door opened 23 minutes later. I counted. Not consciously. Just automatically. He stepped out, the letter still in his hand. Not folded. Not hidden. Held openly. Like he was still trying to understand how something that was supposed to stay internal had become external. They are conducting a full audit, he said.
No greeting.
No context.
Just the fact.
I nodded once. Yes. He watched me carefully. Not searching anymore. Confirming. This includes financial review, he added. Slower now. Each word placed deliberately.
Business accounts.
Transactions. Everything connected. Everything. That word lingered in the air. Because for someone like him, everything is not just numbers. It is identity. It is control. It is proof of who he is in the world. And now it was being examined. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my posture unchanged. That makes sense, I said quietly. No reaction.
No satisfaction.
Just logic. He exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of strain. Not panic.
Not yet.
But pressure. Real pressure. This will affect more than just the claim, he said. Not asking. Informing. I held his gaze. I know. And then, I let the silence stretch again. Because this was not the moment to speak. This was the moment to let him feel the weight of what had already started. He looked down at the letter for a second. Then back at me. You set this in motion, he said. There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Recognition. I nodded once. Yes.
No hesitation. No denial.
Just ownership. Because this part required clarity.
He stepped closer this time.
Not aggressively. Just closer than before. Do you understand what this means? He asked. His voice was quieter now. Lower. Not controlled. Contained. I did not answer immediately. I let the question sit. Because the answer was not something he wanted to hear. It means the system is doing exactly what it is designed to do. I said finally.
Calm. Even.
Final. His jaw tightened again. More visible now. And when it is done, he asked. There it was. The real question. Not what is happening. What is the outcome? I met his eyes. Steady. Unmoving. It will reach a conclusion based on the sequence, I said. Not the explanation. That was the line. The one he could not cross. Because explanations were his strength. Reframing. Redirecting. Rewriting narratives. But sequences do not change. They either align or they expose. He looked at me for a long moment. Longer than any moment before. And in that space, something shifted. Not in me. In him. Because for the first time, he was not trying to control the situation. He was trying to understand it. And that meant he was already behind it. The next notice came the following morning. This time, I saw it. Another letter. Another seal. Different department. Same system. Expansion. Not repetition. Expansion. I did not open it. It was not addressed to me. But I did not need to. I could see the pattern. Audit becomes review. Review becomes inquiry. Inquiry becomes action. Each step pulling more data, connecting more points, building a structure that does not rely on interpretation, only alignment. He did not go to his office that morning. That was the first break in his routine. Instead, he sat at the dining table, documents spread out in front of him, not neatly aligned, not organized, just present. That alone told me everything.
He was no longer controlling the system.
He was reacting to it. I walked past slowly, not stopping, not interrupting, just observing. Because this was no longer about what I would do. It was about what the system was revealing. By noon, the calls started again. Different tone this time. Not defensive. Not explanatory.
Urgent.
Contained urgency. The kind that tries to stay controlled but cannot fully hide the shift underneath. We need to clarify the sequence, he said into the phone. A pause. Then, no. The timing does not indicate intent. Intent. That word had entered the conversation now. That meant the system was no longer just reviewing actions. It was evaluating meaning. And meaning is where everything changes. I stood by the window looking out at the same street. Same light. Same stillness. But everything felt different. Not because something dramatic had happened. Because something irreversible had begun. Behind me, his voice lowered again. Almost a whisper now. This can be explained, he said. And that was the moment I knew. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. This was no longer control. This was defense. And defense means the system has already moved past you. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. Not to rest. To mark it. The exact point where everything shifted from his narrative to reality. 8 minutes. That was all it took for him to make his decision. And now, every system connected to that decision was taking it apart piece by piece. I opened my eyes again, my reflection faintly visible in the window.
Calm. Still.
Unchanged. Because this was never about destroying him. It was about letting the system reveal what he had already done. And once that happens, there is nothing left to control. Only what remains. It did not happen all at once. Not in a single moment. Not with a single phone call or a single document that changed everything overnight. It happened the way systems always do, gradually, then completely. The first freeze came on a Thursday morning. I heard it before I saw it. A chair pulled back too quickly. A sharp exhale. Not loud, but different. Controlled men do not make sharp sounds unless something slips. I stepped into the hallway just as he lowered the phone slowly back onto the table. His expression was not panic. Not yet. But something close to it. Something he had spent his entire life avoiding. Loss of control. They froze one of the accounts, he said.
Not to me.
Not really. Just out loud. I nodded once. No reaction. Because this was not the moment for reaction. This was the moment for observation. Temporary, he added quickly. Standard procedure during review. Standard procedure. That phrase again. But this time, it did not land the same way. Because now it was happening to him. Not something he could explain away. Something he had to experience. By noon, it was not one account. It was 3. Business accounts. Operating funds. Lines of credit placed under review. Each one a layer of a system being paused. Not destroyed. Not yet. Just paused. And for someone like him, pause is worse than loss. Because loss can be calculated, managed,
Contained.
but paused creates uncertainty. And uncertainty cannot be controlled. The calls that day were different. Not structured. Not planned. Reactive. Short bursts of conversation. Then longer silences. Then frustration. Quiet. Controlled frustration. The kind that builds under the surface and has nowhere to go. We have done nothing wrong, he said into the phone at one point. A pause. Then, this is being mischaracterized. Mischaracterized. The final version of denial. Because the system had moved past interpretation. It was now aligning facts. And facts do not shift under pressure. I stayed in the background. Not hidden. Just present. Watching. Listening. Learning. Because even now, even at this stage, there was still something to understand. Not about him. About the process. How it completed. By late afternoon, the second phase began. Not financial. Structural. A request for full disclosure. Not optional. Not negotiable. Required. Documentation. Transactions. Authorizations. Everything connected to the sequence. Everything connected to those 8 minutes. That was the moment it became final. Because once a system asks for everything, it is no longer investigating. It is concluding. He did not say anything when the notice came through.
He just sat there. Still.
Completely still. Hands resting on the table. Eyes fixed on nothing. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. Not control. Not calculation.
Absence.
The absence of a next move. That was something I had never seen in him before. Not once. Not in any situation. Because he always had a move. Always had a strategy. Always had a way to reposition himself. But this was different. There was no repositioning here. Only response. And response that is reactive. Limited.
Contained.
He looked up at me.
Slowly.
Not sharp. Not focused. Just aware. This is going further than it should, he said. Not anger. Not accusation. Just recognition. I held his gaze.
Calm.
Unmoving. It is going exactly where it needs to, I said quietly. And then, I stopped. Because there was nothing else to add. Nothing else to explain. The system was already doing that. Friday morning, it ended. Not dramatically.
Not loudly.
Quietly.
Completely.
At 9:43 a.m., I received the notification. Formal conclusion. Action taken. Accounts frozen pending final resolution. Assets under review. Operational authority suspended. Words. Just words. But behind those words, everything he had built, everything he had controlled, everything he had relied on was no longer his to manage. Not destroyed. Just removed from his control. I read it once. Then again.
Slowly. Not to understand it. To feel the weight of it. Because this was the result. Not of anger. Not of revenge. Of sequence. Of timing. Of 8 minutes that had connected in a way he never expected anyone to see. I placed the phone down gently and walked to the window one last time. The street looked the same. Cars passing.
People moving. Life continuing. Because the world does not stop when something ends. It just moves forward. Behind me, I heard him stand up. The chair scraped lightly against the floor.
Not sharp this time.
Just tired. He did not come closer. He did not speak immediately. He just stood there. And then, "You did this," he said. Not a question. Not an accusation. A fact. I nodded once. "I finished what you started." That was the truth. Not emotional. Not exaggerated. Just accurate. He exhaled slowly. Then, silence. Long, deep. Complete. And in that silence, something settled. Not between us. Within him. Because this was the moment he understood. Not the process. Not the system. The consequence. The direct line between his decision and this outcome. 8 minutes. That was all it took for him to decide I was not worth the cost. And now those same 8 minutes had recalculated everything he thought he controlled. I turned from the window and faced him fully for the first time since this began. Not as his daughter. Not as someone recovering. As someone who had seen the system and used it. "You try to decide when I would stop existing," I said quietly. I just let the system decide what that was worth.
No angit.
No raised voice. Just clarity. He did not respond. Because there was nothing left to say. Not for him. Not for me. The system had already spoken. And systems do not argue. They conclude. I walked past him slowly. Not stopping. Not looking back. Because this was not a victory. It was not something to celebrate. It was a result.
Clean.
Final. Irreversible. And as I stepped out of that house, into the same morning light that had filled the window every day before, I realized something simple. He thought my life was a cost he could choose not to pay. He just did not realize. I was the one keeping the account.